If you love animated content that breaks down book summaries and dives into fascinating topics, we'd love your support. Creating these videos takes a lot of time and effort, and by subscribing, you help us continue bringing you this valuable content consistently. Your support means the world to us. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this exciting journey. And now, let's continue with the video. Quiet. Chapter 1: The Power of Introverts. In 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a crowded bus. She was arrested, inspiring a year-long bus boycott and pivoting the entire civil rights movement. She was arrested, inspiring a year-long bus boycott and pivoting the entire civil rights movement. As someone capable of standing up to a busload of angry passengers, many of us might think of Parks as an exceptionally bold woman. But in fact, Parks was described as shy, quiet, and humble by most of her friends. This might sound like a paradox. How can someone be courageous and quiet? Maybe we should ask instead, why do we often view these two qualities as mutually exclusive? To answer this question, we need to better understand introverts and their place in our culture. It might surprise you to learn many important figures in politics, business, and creative fields are introverts. Introverts are people who tend to benefit from alone time. They look inwards, focusing on their own thoughts. And some introverts find socializing to be effortful or unpleasant at times. But even though at least 1/3 of people in the United States identify as introverts, they often feel pressure to act more outgoing. Perhaps this is because society doesn't appropriately value creativity and thoughtfulness, key qualities of introverts. Instead, we tend to reward people who are talkative and outgoing. In surveys, talkative people are consistently rated as smarter, better looking, and more interesting than quieter people. But if we can overcome this bias, we can learn to embrace the power of introversion. Susan Cain wrote Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking because she believes introverts are undervalued. She examines social science research and the stories of successful introverts, like Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, and Rosa Parks. And she shows how their success is due to their introversion, not in spite of it. If you're an introvert, you'll learn the power of your reflective and deliberate thinking. If you're not an introvert, you'll learn how to harness moments of quiet to improve your productivity and decision-making. And if you're not sure, first you'll learn where you fall on the personality spectrum. Chapter 2: What Makes Someone an Introvert. Influential psychologist Carl Jung first popularized the terms introvert and extrovert in 1921. Jung described introverts as inwardly focused on their thought and feelings. As Cain says, they recharge their batteries by being alone. Extroverts, meanwhile, prefer the external world of people and activities and recharge by socializing. Jung's descriptions are often debated. To date, there is no universally accepted definition of either. But modern science tends to agree that the difference between extroverts and introverts is the need for stimulation. Stimulation is the amount of input we get from the outside world. To function well, introverts require less external stimulation than extroverts. Extroverts might prefer a lively party or a group project, whereas introverts would prefer an evening at home or a solo endeavor. In the late 1960s, psychologist Hans Eysenck demonstrated these different responses to stimulation in a now-famous experiment. In his study, Eysenck had both introverts and extroverts place lemon juice on their tongues. The introverts produced more saliva than the extroverts. Though they received the same amount of stimulation, the introverts reacted more strongly than the extroverts. Because introverts and extroverts react to stimulation differently, they often act differently at work and in social situations. Extroverts tend to finish tasks quickly. They're good at multitasking and often aren't afraid to take risks. Meanwhile, introverts may prefer to work slowly and deliberately, focusing on one task at a time. In their social life, extroverts are the life of the party. But this also means they require more company. They can be dominant and assertive and generally are not afraid of conflict. In conversation, they can think quickly and don't struggle to find the right words for things. Meanwhile, introverts may have great social skills, but after a while, they'd rather be home alone. They tend to dislike small talk and conflict. These introspective tendencies of introverts give them a great power. Introverts can harness quiet, focused moments full of creativity and productivity. And yet, our society generally prizes extroversion. Where did this cultural preference for being outgoing come from? We'll uncover that next. Chapter 3: How Extroversion Became the Cultural Ideal. Quiet. Dale Carnegie, the acclaimed public speaking expert, came of age in a burgeoning industrial America. By the time Carnegie graduated college in 1908, Ford, JCPenney, and Sears were all household names. Industrialization drove people, like Carnegie, to leave their rural hometowns and seek new opportunities. Between 1840 and 1920, Americans who lived in cities jumped from 8% to more than 30%. This dramatic shift in environment also created a new standard for personality. Before, people living in rural communities knew their neighbors and lived with their families. In this context, integrity and hard work were highly valued. But as people moved to cities, they had to compete for jobs and constantly interact with strangers. This gave rise to the culture of personality, an environment that rewarded extroversion. Individuals needed to be outgoing, not only to get jobs, but to sell the products corporate America was churning out. This compelled Dale Carnegie to start teaching public speaking courses and eventually publish his first self-help book in 1913. Now, over 100 years later, Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People is still a bestseller. We've inherited the culture of personality from an early industrial America. But the culture of personality has had negative consequences on society. The culture of personality has encouraged something Cain calls the extrovert ideal. The extrovert ideal is the belief that the ideal self is gregarious, alpha, and comfortable in the spotlight. This ideal prioritizes quick decisions, risk-taking, and group work. The extrovert ideal caused self-help books to boom throughout the 20th century. These books promised to teach people how to be extroverted enough to succeed. Then, in 1955, a drug company released an anti-anxiety medication. Many people thought of anxiety as a natural byproduct of a dog-eat-dog and hypersocial world. And within 5 years, a third of all prescriptions from U.S. doctors were for anti-anxiety medication. Cain argues that excessive encouragement of extroversion led to high levels of anxiety. Yet today, our culture still promotes the extrovert ideal as the clearest path to success. We'll investigate if extroversion is actually the key to success next. Chapter 4: How Collaboration Can Hinder Success. Quiet. In the 1980s, a consultant named Tom DeMarco started to notice some differences in work environments he visited. Some workspaces were densely packed, whereas others gave more private space to their employees. When employees were closer together, they interacted more, and DeMarco wondered what effect that was having on performance. To investigate this, he and his colleague Timothy Lister created a study called the Coding War Games. Its goal was to identify the best and worst-performing computer programmers from a pool of 600 employees across 92 companies. They asked participants to design, code, and test a program in their normal office space. The results provided a shocking conclusion. There was a huge performance gap. The best programmers were 10 times more productive than the worst. Performance had little correlation with experience, pay, or time dedicated to the exercise. However, a large number of the highest performers belonged to companies that gave them more privacy, autonomy, and space to work. 62% of the best performers said they had acceptably private workspace. Meanwhile, 76% of the worst performers said they were often interrupted while they worked. The coding war games exemplify a larger issue in our contemporary view of collaboration. We often encourage collaboration and thereby extroversion, even when it leads to lower quality work. The coding war games reveal the impact of a trend that Cain calls the new groupthink. The new groupthink prioritizes teamwork, extroversion, and highly social work environments. This phenomenon has bled into the organizational structure of corporations. In a recent survey, 91% of high-level corporate managers believe teams were the key to success. And over 70% of modern-day employees work in an office with an open floor plan. From 1970 to 2010, the space allotted to each employee shrank from 500 to 200 square feet. Studies have shown, however, that work environments like these reduce productivity and impair memory. They make individuals hostile, more susceptible to illness, and can lead to increased levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. And most notably, they can lead to worse performance, as we saw in the coding war game. To mitigate these negative effects, Cain says, we don't need to shut down all collaborative work environments. Rather, she believes it's vital to create a balance. Cain uses Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, as an example. Wozniak benefited creatively from a community of computer engineers called the Homebrew Computer Club. But he also needed to be able to work alone, so he could finish his prototype of a personal computer. 3 months after he finished it, he and Jobs founded Apple. Everyone needs both space to collaborate and space to focus alone, just like Wozniak had. These kinds of workplaces will benefit both extroverts and introverts. Chapter 5: The Biology of Extroversion and Introversion. Quiet. Jerome Kagan has dedicated his career to studying the cognitive and emotional development of children. In 1989, he began one of the most important longitudinal studies of personality ever conducted. Kagan brought 500 4-month-old children into his laboratory for child development at Harvard University. His goal was to ascertain which babies were likely to become extroverts and which were likely to become introverts. He and his team exposed the children to a set of stimuli like balloons popping, the smell of alcohol, or new voices. About 20% of the babies cried and physically reacted by waving their arms or legs, a group which Kagan called high reactive. Another 40% stayed quiet and relatively calm, a group he called low reactive. The remaining 40% had reactions somewhere in the middle. Kagan predicted those who reacted strongly to the unfamiliar stimulus would grow up to be introverts. And those who reacted indifferently to the stimulus would grow up to be extroverts. As these children continued returning to Kagan's lab through their adolescence, many of them turned out exactly as he predicted. In other words, high reactivity to stimuli in early childhood tended to predict introversion in adulthood. Why were some babies more reactive to unfamiliar stimuli than others? One answer is that young children differ in terms of how sensitive their brains are to novelty. Specifically, one region of the brain called the amygdala helps you respond to anything new and determine if it's a threat. During their study, Kagan's team measured physiological changes related to amygdala activity, like blood pressure and temperature. The experiments showed that introverted children tended to have more excitable amygdalas. Kids with more excitable amygdalas were more sensitive to novelty, like meeting new people or hearing new sounds. And the sensitivity of their amygdala manifested in how they interacted with the world for the rest of their lives. So, personality and biology are closely connected. And studies have suggested that introversion and extroversion are about 40 to 50% heritable. But does our biology totally determine our personality? Or are there things we can do to change who we are? Chapter 6: The Role of Free Will. If you're born to be an extrovert or introvert, can you decide how you want to behave? Neurologist Dr. Carl Schwartz sought to investigate this very question. In his experiments, Schwartz picked up where Kagan's childhood extroversion and introversion experiments left off. Remember, Kagan's experiments exposed children to unfamiliar stimuli and noted how they reacted. These studies showed that the amygdala plays a role in how extroverted or introverted we are. In his subsequent experiments, Schwartz tested the same children, now grown, that Kagan had originally tested. Schwartz, however, had access to technology that Kagan did not. He had an fMRI scanner, a machine that measures what parts of the brain are most active during a given task. In his experiments, Schwartz showed Kagan's same subjects pictures of unfamiliar faces. And as he did, he used the fMRI scanner to measure their amygdala activity. When Cain spoke with Schwartz, his research was still ongoing, though he had just received data for the first set of subjects. His preliminary results suggest that amygdala sensitivity is stable over an individual's lifespan. Children with sensitive amygdalas grew into adults with sensitive amygdalas. This was true even for children who had grown up to act more outgoing. People can modify their behavior to be outgoing, even if they have a genetic predisposition for introversion. What Schwartz's experiments suggest is that we can change our personality, though not completely. Our genetic predispositions do affect our personality, but there are ways to modify our behavior. Cain uses her own fear of speaking to strangers as an example. Over the years, Cain has succeeded in conquering this fear in small doses. Whenever she panics about speaking to a group of people, she tries to calm herself down. Another part of the brain, the neocortex, makes this possible. The neocortex enables our logic and reasoning. Over time, people with highly reactive amygdalas can calm themselves down using logic and reasoning with their neocortex. Though their sensitive amygdala might detect a threat, they can remind themselves that they are not in danger. This soothing self-talk decreases activity in the amygdala. In Cain's case, she's calmed herself down before speaking to new people so often that now she does it automatically. You can also modify your behavior in small incremental ways, regardless of your genetic predisposition. So, even if your amygdala is very sensitive to threat, you can learn to calm yourself down. You can remind yourself that you're not in danger, even if your amygdala is telling you are. Eventually, this soothing self-talk can occur automatically, just like Cain's does. Chapter 7. Did extroversion cause Wall Street to crash? Boykin Curry was a managing director of the investment firm Eagle Capital during the 2008 Wall Street crash, and he has a theory of what caused it. He believes that aggressive extroverts were responsible for the economic meltdown, partially because of their disregard for an idea called FUD. FUD stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. People at the helm of some financial institutions threw caution to the wind, ignoring FUD. They bet on the subprime mortgage market and invested in risk. People with certain personality types got control of capital and institutions and power, Curry told Cain. And people who are congenitally more cautious and introverted and statistical in their thinking became discredited and pushed aside. Extroverts are more likely to take risks. Introverts are more likely to act cautiously. But how does extroversion relate to risk-taking? Introverts and extroverts think differently, especially when it comes to risk-taking. This is because extroverts are more likely to be reward-sensitive. People who are reward-sensitive are more motivated to seek rewards, whether that be money, sex, or social status. These reward-seeking behaviors are housed in the amygdala, the part of the brain we explored in Chapter 5. Just as the amygdala makes introverts sensitive to novelty, it makes extroverts sensitive to rewards. This is because extroverts' dopamine pathways appear to be more active than those of introverts. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Increased levels of dopamine are associated with risk-taking behaviors, including taking financial risks. Studies have found that a variation of a dopamine-regulating gene is a strong predictor of financial risk-taking. This gene variation is more common in extroverts. Perhaps, if more introverts were in control, we could have avoided the risky behaviors that caused the 2008 economic crash. If so, Cain says, financial institutions should try to hire a mix of introverts and extroverts. Chapter 8. Can you pretend to be extroverted? Quiet. Brian Little is a psychology professor at Harvard University. Little is adored by his students. He's described as a cross between Robin Williams and Albert Einstein. He regularly tells jokes and breaks into song during lecture. Little is also somewhat reclusive. He prefers to spend his downtime alone, and if socializing, regularly needs breaks to be by himself. How can Little have two personalities? The answer lies in something Little himself developed called free trait theory. Free trait theory holds that we are born with certain personality traits, like introversion. Little theorizes that we can act out of character when it's in service of a core personal project. This means introverts are capable of acting like extroverts if they're doing something they love, as Little does while teaching. Research conducted by psychologist Richard Lippa corroborates the idea that introverts can pretend to be extroverts. In his experiments, introverts were asked to imitate the behaviors of extroverts. Introverts, although not perfectly, could imitate extroverts pretty convincingly. So if introverts can pretend to be extroverted, should they? If you're pushing yourself to act extroverted all the time, you risk the chance of burning out. Like Little suggests, introverts who act extroverted benefit only when it's in the service of something they love. If you force yourself to act extroverted because you think it's required for success, you're doomed to feel inferior. But if instead you think, I'm going to be extroverted to advance a specific project I care about, you'll feel inspired. To identify what these projects might look like, Cain provides 3 steps. First, think about what you were excited to do as a child. Though the exact activity or goal might not be relevant, the underlying meaning still is. Maybe you wanted to be a fireman. What about being a fireman excited you? Second, pay attention to the work you're naturally inspired to do. Perhaps you find yourself signing up for volunteer committees. Your dreams of being a firefighter and your volunteer work are alike. Perhaps helping people matters to you. Third, notice who you envy. The people who you envy might be a window into the kinds of projects you should pursue. Once you take into account what projects matter to you, you won't mind acting differently once in a while. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this exciting journey.